Greetings, viewers. So this is a brief overview of Chapter 4 of my text, The Third Supercycle. And the title of this is The Three Counterfactuals of the 1916-1922 Uprisings. Now, a counterfactual is simply a speculative question about history, and it's asking not just what could have happened differently, but also if things could have happened differently, if there was some free play, there were possibilities, why were certain pathways taken, certain choices made, and other choices were not made. Certain pathways were not taken. And the counterfactuals in question all relate to the emergence of the Leninist party state in the former Romanov Empire in 1917. Party state wages a brutal civil war against various competitors, and it wins power, it consolidates power, and creates the Soviet Empire. So the counterfactuals are, could it have been different? Was what happened, namely Stalinism, inevitable? Or was a different history possible for that part of the world? And the chapter basically argues that actually no, there was no other way for that particular revolution to evolve for some very good reasons, which had to do with how those other revolutions took place. So I said before, in 1916, 1922, there is a wave, an enormous number, dozens of uprisings and revolutions break out, and they shatter four empires, and they create a number of new polities. So the question is, why did the Leninist party state create a certain kind of polity but not other sorts of polities? So the three counterfactuals are, number one, the Polish national uprising under Pilsudski, which establishes an independent Poland. Number two, the Turkish national uprising of Mustafa Kemal, Kemalism, which constructs an independent Turkey. And finally, the third, the Mexican Revolution, which creates a modern Mexican state between 1911 and 1920, and eventually comes under the consolidated monopoly rule of the PRI, which would rule for 71 years, the late 1920s all the way into the 1990s. And each of these counterfactuals, by the way, is broadly typical of a specific region. So the Polish National Revolution, very comparable to what happens in Estonia, Finland, Latvia, and Lithuania. Kemalism in Turkey has a number of parallels with the emergence of Yugoslavia in 1918. So what happens in Yugoslavia is there are a number of smaller states, and they unite, and they create a modernizing monarchy under a king called Yugoslavia, and unite. And eventually, over a longer period of time, that union would come apart, but it did succeed in the short run at creating a dynastic polity, which in many respects sort of echoed certain structures. You can read certain parallels between Yugoslavia and its monarchic phase and the Austrian Empire under the Habsburgs, because both are sort of multinational entities that try to solve the problem of local autonomy of different groups by a kind of a centralizing authoritarian central figure who would presumably be the neutral arbiter between the different identities, factions, and so enable everyone to get along. And then finally, the third counterfactual, the Mexican Revolution, probably has its closest parallels with sort of the national revolutions that take place in Austria, Czechoslovakia, Germany, and Hungary, which either they're all fragments of empires or former cores of former empires that have to reinvent themselves in a certain way, and of course run into all kinds of problems, and we'll talk about those problems later. So, running through these counterfactuals one by one. So the very first one, the Polish uprising. So the key question here is, why wasn't Soviet Muscovy just another version of the Polish uprising? Why didn't they just create a state similar to Poland? So an ethnicity, and okay, you're allegedly Russia, right? So why not just create a modern Russia? And even if it's authoritarian or under military rule of some kind, why not just an ordinary state like the other states? And the answer to that counterfactual is there's no such thing as an ordinary state. Such a beast does not exist. We're in a world where, until recently, as late as 1910, 90% of the planet are administered and controlled by 14 colonial empires. So imperial thinking is in everyone's minds. Ordinary people structure their lives according to imperial dictates. So dynasties, feudalism, semi-feudalism, these are powerful forces in people's lives and condition the way people think. So it's very, very difficult to establish a new state in such an environment. Poland solves this problem because they had a long tradition of anti-colonial nationalism, of struggle against empires that controlled Poland and partitioned it and occupied it in various ways. And out of that long history of struggle gave them the tools they need for a certain level of national independence. Because they'd struggled for so long and struggled, they had a core national identity of resistance to external imperial control. Same thing is true for Finland, colonized by the Swedish monarchy a long time ago, but struggled to retain its autonomy, and then was taken over by the Romanov Empire in 1808, struggled against that, on and on and on and on and on. So that model of an anti-colonial nationalism that did not exist in Muscovy in 1917 didn't exist. It was this giant, vast polity with very, very complex, with this wide mixture of confessions and identities and languages, and there's no way to rule it. There was no consensus on that. So that model was not possible. There were attempts made. There were small factions in the Muscovite Civil War, which would, try to institute such a program, but were defeated by the Leninist Party state. And the Leninist Party state was just able to mobilize more people, or rather, it was able to mobilize the most people and the most resources in the space of Muscovy. The other crucial tip about the Leninist Party state, and again, historians have sort of missed this, but they should actually stop and think about this. Why was it that the Leninist Party state only succeeded in Muscovy? It actually doesn't succeed anywhere else. And wherever there are other places, the most powerful form of politics and political allegiance that takes place in the former Romanov Empire is really anti-colonial nationalism. And this is true of Armenia, it's true of Georgia, it's true of Mongolia, on and on. All these other spaces, they go in their own direction, and then only later are they incorporated into the Soviet Empire under a kind of a neo-colonial bargain. But that anti-colonial never fully goes away. The heartland for the Leninist Party state is always Muscovy. And this relates to the fact that Soviet Muscovy is very much an imperial project, rooted in a certain place in a certain time, and therefore it has to be authoritarian, and it has to kind of do the things that it does. They don't have the option of a potentially liberating anti-colonial nationalism. That's not in the cards. There's no space for that within that imperial structure. Okay. Second counterfactual, Kemalist Turkey. So here we have a very interesting example. In some ways, it's actually directly relevant to the Leninist Party state. So the Leninist Party state emerges in Muscovy, which is the core of the former Romanov Empire, 50% of its center. Kemalist Turkey also emerges in the core, essentially the Anatolian core of the former Ottoman Empire. And eventually the territory it controls is about 14 million people and roughly 2/3 the size of the Ottoman Empire in 1914. And there again, the question is immediately answered by itself, because Mustafa Kemal was an army officer in the Ottoman Empire, a decorated officer, fought very hard for the Ottomans, and then when the Ottoman Empire is defeated, after the war, he takes on the role of savior and he creates a Turkish national state. So he plays the role of the military-industrial dynast. There's no such figure in the history of Muscovy ever, though I think on a certain level Vladimir Putin would like to believe he's Kemal, but he's not. He's a petty KGB thug who's a failure and will remain a failure. But Kemal was actually a genuinely talented politician who built essentially a very military-dominated post-colonial regime, but an effective regime that could, run a society effectively. And he was also very crafty about negotiating with the Entente powers and playing them off against each other. The other thing is that Turkey was in the midst of a serious crisis because after the war, there was an invasion by Greece. So the Greeks wanted control of parts of what are today Western Turkey. And there was a significant Greek population there, but they were a minority. Most were Turkish-speaking members of the Anatolian Peninsula or Anatolian region. So this was very clearly kind of an irredentist project that the Entente was very uncomfortable with, and they didn't want to see this happen because they knew this was going to be a disaster. So essentially, Kemalism played the card of national salvation. So uniting the country against a foreign threat, and built his army in that respect, and then used that army to take power and launch a program of domestic modernization. So that's not really the case for the Leninist Party state, because there you have this civil war issue where you're struggling against a previous monarchy and the main antagonist is not some foreign power. Again, there's a limited parallel in the sense that, okay, the Polish-Soviet War, this is a power on your border that invades what would later become Ukraine and attacks you, or is in conflict with you, and then Soviets would respond by driving Poland back and so on and so forth. But it's also not the case because Muscovy is this huge space and it spends most of its time in the Civil War. Most of the fighting actually takes place outside of the Muscovite heartland. Like most of the Civil War is the Leninist Party state imposing its order on the former Romanov colonies. Places like Ukraine, places like Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and on and on and on. That's actually where the main battles are taking place. That's the fight that takes place in 1920, 1921, 22. So again, there's not a consolidation of an ethnic core in that respect. Also, there isn't the institution of the dynastic army to hold things together. So the Romanov army completely disintegrates, and the Red Army is a completely different beast, even though it has some personnel from the former Romanov army. But it's a completely different beast, subject to tight political control by the Leninist Party state. So again, the histories don't match, the situations don't match, so the Kemalist solution is not possible for the Leninist Party state. It doesn't happen that way. The third counterfactual, the Mexican Revolution. And it might seem to be very strange to put the Mexican Revolution next to the Soviet Revolution, but actually, if you stop and think about it, they have a lot of things in common. Mexico and the Romanov Empire are semi-peripheries. So they're rural societies, large rural population, but with significant neo-colonial industrialization that creates enormous social tensions that explode into this vicious conflicts and ultimately very fratricidal civil wars. So there's actually a fair number of similarities amidst all the differences. Now, the main difference is quite obvious. The Mexican Revolution is mostly an internal affair due to the failure of a certain kind of neo-colonial modernization project under Porfirio Diaz, whose dictatorship falls apart, and then there's a brutal struggle over where Mexico goes next, how to create a national polity. And different factions, so the Zapatismo, Villerismo, and the Constitutionalists all struggle for authority and hegemony, and eventually the Constitutionalists win. The difference is that the Leninist Party state emerges on the back of a world war, which completely demolishes and disrupts Romanov society, and particularly the rural sector of the society, implodes the rural economy, causes widespread suffering, brutalizes a whole generation, kills large numbers of people, but also distributes weapons to large numbers of individuals, making society very unstable. And then a brutal civil war where there's some level of international intervention and mass mobilization. And so there's nothing like that takes place in Mexico. Mexico, the story is mostly domestic fight between domestic interests. There's some small intervention. The United States sends a small army because of Pancho Villa's incursion into the southern part of the United States, but they don't occupy significant territory, and they chase after Villa, and Pancho Villa don't find him and eventually withdraw. So the foreign part of the story really isn't there, whereas the World War I is crucial to the rise of the Leninist Party state. No World War I, and you do not have the Leninist Party state or the revolutions that break out when and where they do. So, again, good example of the kind of a historical overdetermination and a counterfactual where there are all these similarities, and then you look carefully and you realize there are also these profound differences as well. The very last thing to mention here, the last part of the chapter switches gears slightly, and this is actually an anticipation of things to come later on in the text, by talking about culture, and specifically the rise of national culture. Because one of the very, very interesting things that happens is that in the post-1914 period, there's this massive transformation of culture. But this massive transformation intersects only very intermittently and unevenly with these uprisings, the uprisings of 1916, 1922. So this is very, very fascinating contradiction between there are all these revolutions breaking out politically, but they don't talk to each other and they fight against each other. Then there are all these aesthetic revolutions breaking out, but they have very little to do with the politics. There are all these isolated uprisings happening, but they're not yet unified. They don't regard themselves in a common struggle just yet. And nor is that possible because the means of communication are very limited. In this period of history, there's a telegraph and there are railroads, but sailing vessels are still around and steamships are the main technology, and literacy rates are low around the world. And so what we have is this enormous breakout of new national cultures and of anti-colonial struggles and new forms of culture, and it'll take time to build up forms of solidarity between them. So this is the beginning of changes, but not the opening act of an actual solidarity between these different struggles. The last thing that I'll mention here is one of the things that this chapter flags specifically is this remarkable transformation in the aesthetic content, in forms and content. And I'll just leave this last thought with you. I talk about aesthetics in greater detail in the chapters to come. But there's a remarkable shift between 1914 and 1915 and the aesthetic works that appear in 1916, 1922. And in a way, this shift is sort of the unconscious imprint of the uprisings. It's like the uprisings, they don't seem to change that much. Many of them fail, but something else is happening, some deeper transformation is happening, and it leaves its mark in aesthetics, even though the politics is frustrated and only does limited things, but the revolution keeps happening on the level of aesthetics. So in music, the field of music, this is the shift from the late 19th century Wagnerian and Mahler chromaticism to the early works of 12-tone technique. So it's the serial techniques of music, where this industrialization of music and tonality breaks down completely. In painting, this is the shift from Cubism prior to 1914 to Expressionism and Surrealism in the 1910s and 1920s. So there's extraordinary change in the way that painting functions. In poetry, this is the shift from symbolism of Mallarmé to the bricolage of the 1910s and 1920s, full-fledged modernism, T.S. Eliot and others, many, many others, the Harlem Renaissance, most specifically Langston Hughes. In prose, this is the shift from naturalism to interior monologue and what we might call the vernacular modernisms of James Joyce and a wide variety of other authors and writers. And in cinema and film, this is the shift from the fixed camera position, where film prior to 1914 is mostly it's very much like photography and it follows a lot of the rules of photography, to the mobile camera. So the camera starts to move after 1914, and this will result in D.W. Griffith's a conservative and somewhat reactionary example, but of course the great breakthrough works of Charlie Chaplin, who uses the camera to democratize the film space, and also democratizes film space in the sense that you have this new character, the tramp, the ordinary person, the ordinary worker seeking work, unemployed, and in this struggle to survive against much bigger opponents. And this tale of struggle and survival and endurance, but also the sort of quest for personal dignity by ordinary people, becomes a source of amazing comedy. Chaplin will become an international superstar because of his capacity to depict these struggles. And working people could go to the theater and they could see themselves for the first time. They could see their own struggles. They could see their own quest for dignity in Chaplin's stories and his characters. So I'll stop here. The very last thing that I'll mention is that the chapter concludes on the final note, which is that after the cycle of revolutions from 1916 to 1922 concludes, and they go about as far as they can go, what happens is a reaction, a turn to revanchism. And this will be a very different kind of revanchism. This will be an international revanchism, not like the national versions of the 19th century, but a truly international phenomenon of trying to go back, trying to reset, trying to restore hierarchies that are crumbling. And that will be the subject of chapter 5.